Friday morning. Welcome inside Mr. Small's Theater. This is Geiks Got Game, and I'm your host, flying solo for the morning, Matt Geitka. G-A-J-T-K-A is how you spell my last name, but the beauty of radio is spelling isn't important. We're all here together, and you don't have to take any tests or anything like that. I'm going to take it really easy on you on this Friday, 10 to 11. Most Fridays right here live, with few exceptions, from Millvale. Brian Crawford's to my left, stage right, on the ones and twos, pulling the switches and producing the show, as he usually is, and I'm happy to have you along, whether you are a usual, whether you're a regular, and I know your name, or you're a newcomer to the program. If you are a newcomer, or heck, even if you've been around for a while, maybe it bears reminding that this is not typical sports talk radio. I enjoy the form here at the River's Edge because I get to stretch my legs and be more expansive about topics that in normal sports talk radio, you'd have to burn through and go to the calls and go to the commercials, take a break. We do take breaks on Geiks Got Game, and in fact, there are 3 of them typically. But I can talk for as long as I want, and I can get to my point without being rushed. And I think there are people out there who appreciate that. I know I appreciate it as the man doing the speaking. Maybe you do appreciate that too. I think in this era of podcasting as well, where there's more of an emphasis on the long form, and perhaps written word is the same case as well. There's unlimited space out there on the internet, so why not take advantage of that? Not to say that I try to be long-winded, but that's how the show goes. And in today's program, I do want to talk some college hockey. I'm headed up to Penn State University. They call it Hockey Valley these days, and it's one of the greatest success stories in, I think, college sports overall, is how great Penn State has come out of the gate with both the men's program and the women's program, but focusing on the men's program, having had all the success it's had in the past 2 years, after not even having a Division I team in 2011-12. They had a long history of club hockey success at Penn State, of course, but with the donation of prominent alum Terry Pegula, now the owner of both the Buffalo Sabres and the Buffalo Bills, Penn State was able to start a program, and it was a very different start to their history than it was for the hockey team that I work for, the RMU men's hockey team, which plays down at the island. That was more a program from scratch, with head coach Derek Schooley taking over with just a desk and a phone, as he likes to talk about. So I find this weekend's matchup between RMU and Penn State in the men's hockey arena to be very compelling because of those reasons. It's 2 upstart programs. It's the 2 youngest programs. Well, it was the 2 youngest programs in NCAA men's hockey until a couple of years ago when Arizona State came in. But 2 of the younger programs in a very traditional sport, and how they've both gone about carving out their own spaces in very sports-mad markets. Here in Pittsburgh, of course, with RMU, and up at State College, you know they love their sports, especially football, at Penn State. So I'll get to that in just a bit. I find that such a compelling matchup, no matter where it is. And it's going to be at Pegula Ice Arena up at State College tonight. I'll be taking off with the RMU hockey team via bus through the mountain passes of western Pennsylvania in just a couple of hours. And then it'll be on the island on Saturday. So if you have a chance, go down there and check out some high-level college hockey. But I will be talking about hockey to start this show, but not the college variety. It's pro hockey, and so much news in the NHL this past week relating to changes in leadership, and that's what I want to get to here at the start of the program. But before I get to the meat of the show, I want to remind you that I'm on social media, on Twitter, at Matt Geitka. I mentioned it, G-A-J-T-K-A. Simple as that. No underscores, no spaces, no special characters, no anything necessary when you have a name like this one. Also on Facebook, Matt Geitka Media is where you can find all my professional offerings. Yes, I have a personal page, but no, I don't really care to open that up to the public. Some things have to be at least semi-private, right, in this era of online transparency. So, yeah, you can find my forward-facing stuff, if you will, at Matt Geitka Media, including this show, which is simulcast there in video form every Friday, thanks to Brian Crawford and the folks at the River's Edge. So, the Penguins. No leadership changes, it doesn't appear, are in the offing in Pittsburgh, but plenty of angst for the Penguins as they've gone winless in 5. It wasn't long ago, in fact, what was it, 2 weeks ago, that I was talking about a team surging through Western Canada, scoring a ton of goals, and I think the current state of the NHL might be better served or better positioned for a Penguins team like they are to succeed because they have the offensive firepower still, you would imagine, and I think they will have a little bit more of that when they get some players back from injury, but not a defense-focused team necessarily. But they've been giving up a lot, and they have been scoring a lot lately. That's not a recipe for success, clearly. The 2-1 loss to Washington just this past Wednesday night on national television might have been their best performance since that winning streak when they went through Canada, Toronto, and Calgary, and Edmonton, and Vancouver, and went 4-0. That was terrific, but, the other night against Washington, they had plenty of opportunities but couldn't cash in. That's hockey sometimes. You might outplay the opposition, but they pull it out in the end. That's exactly what happened on Wednesday night. And if this were in the midst of just a run-of-the-mill stretch for a contending team, say 7 out of 10 games on the plus side, then we wouldn't even pay much attention to it. But since, as I mentioned, the Penguins were entering that game on a slump, having not won in 4 in a row, making it 5 in a row, the first time that's ever happened in the Mike Sullivan era, which is going on 3 years now, well, yeah, that'll stand out. And that'll be something that we'll all maybe give more thought to, devote more analysis to than we would usually. But should we? I don't know about that. I think it's still very early of a point in the season to be talking big existential things with the Penguins, and do they need to make big changes? But apparently not for Jim Rutherford, who went on the Penguins radio network. He has a show twice a month with Josh Getzoff there, their excellent host of their many radio offerings. And I want to read some of this stuff verbatim that Jim Rutherford said to Josh Getzoff before the Capitals game, as the Penguins carried that 0-3-1 stretch into the game, and a very ugly 0-3-1 stretch at that. So here are the words of Jim Rutherford. "What I'm seeing, I don't like," he said. "Nobody likes it. We're trying to figure out what's gone wrong here. And mind you, this is still a team that has a winning record." Back to Rutherford. "Has this team been together too long? It's always something I have to watch for. When do you have to make those changes? The players are doing everything they can to tell me now's the time." So, all right. Rutherford is an old school GM in a lot of ways. And one of the ways that he's old school is that he uses the media to deliver messages. I think you get that from more of the old timers. And I'm not being ageist here. That's just a product of the era. And back in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and heck, even the last decade, maybe the best way to get a public message across would be through traditional media sources. And I know that this is under the Penguins house organ of the Penguins radio network, but still, this is more of a way that an old-time GM would do it and try to send a message that way instead of going directly to the team, or maybe in addition to going directly to the team. I don't know exactly what Rutherford has said to the squad. I don't feel like he's a very hands-on GM in terms of going down to the locker room and storming in there after a game in which he doesn't like the performance. I think he leaves that stuff more to the coaching staff, and I think that's probably more of an appropriate way to do it. But Rutherford is very upfront as well with media sources, and that's also an old school approach. And when I was on the beat, I enjoyed that because you felt like he wasn't BSing you. He was giving you what he really felt, and he wasn't giving you everything he felt, but he was giving you enough. And it was all strategic. I didn't think, don't misunderstand, I didn't think that we were his personal confidants or anything. Everything was done with a purpose and a message to deliver, but it was still refreshing to be able to get something that's interesting, as opposed to, well, to compare him to a GM across town in Neil Huntington with the Pirates. You can't really take a lot of that with face value because he's not going to overtly criticize players, and he's not going to reveal too much. He's not going to show you his cards. Kevin Colbert at the Steelers, for God's sake, he talks once a year, I think, maybe twice a year. So, he's definitely on the opposite end of the Jim Rutherford spectrum. But I want to go back just to finish up some of these direct quotes from Jim. He also said, "We're not playing with any energy or determination. We're just trying to get through the games. These other teams are coming and outworking us. They deserve to beat us. In some of these games, they probably deserve to beat us worse than the score indicates." And here's where it gets interesting from Jim. "At a young age," he says, "guys win Stanley Cups, and a lot of guys go their whole career, and they don't even get close to it again. We've got some young guys that won a couple, and then they get bigger contracts, and they kind of settle in. They forget what got them to where they are today. Then we have some guys on the team who are working toward a contract next offseason, so maybe they change their game. They think scoring more goals and getting more points is what's going to get them more money. They get away from their game, what their role is. I see that happening with some of the guys on both ends of my point here." Okay, so Jim Rutherford is saying some very different things here. He's saying some players are easing off the gas and letting the stars do their work and just being content to be passengers on the Penguins train. Maybe he's talking about I don't know, Brian Russ perhaps is a name that comes to mind. Brian Dumoulin, another guy who signed a contract recently who would be considered, quote, young in the context of professional sports. And then he's saying that some players are trying too hard to do too much. Maybe Carl Hagelin, maybe Riley Sheehan, both of whom are pending unrestricted free agents. So there's a lot there from Jim Rutherford. And for me, it came off initially like he was throwing a bunch of crap at the wall and see what sticks. And maybe he said too much. And I don't typically say this about GMs because, as I said, as a member of the media, as someone who is currently, formerly on the beat and currently following the team closely, this is juicy stuff, right? This is what you want to get. You want to get actual insight, not the coach speak, not the GM speak, not the sanitized version, not the cliched version. So I applaud Jim Rutherford for that, as I always have, because he sure makes things interesting. But in a lot of ways, this comes off, as Ryan Wilson put it on his blog on Hockey Buzz earlier this week, this comes off as a man in a glass house throwing stones because, Jim, this is your roster. These are your decisions that you made. And maybe there's some anger there from Jim. I think there is some anger there from Jim because he says, well, I trusted Brian Russ, and I trusted Brian Dumoulin, and I trusted Daniel Sprong. I drafted him. I hyped him up for 3 years, and he's not looking like he's able to deliver, at least not in his current role, in how Mike Sullivan is deploying him. And these players are letting me down. I'm sure there's a lot of that when you are a GM in pro sports. I can relate to that as a parent, right? There's a little bit of that too. You say, well, I put you in the right spots to do the right things, and you aren't doing the right things. So then maybe you question yourself, or you question, in my case, my young son, or in Jim Rutherford's case, his younger players on the Penguins team. So there's probably some of that emotion, and maybe some of that is best left behind the scenes because, as I said, it comes off as a guy just grasping for straws and saying, well, maybe I need to make some big changes. And in the case of the Penguins, what would be big changes? Well, you're not going to move Crosby or Malkin or Kessel or Letang. All those guys have limited no-move clauses or just straight-up no-movement clauses. So it's going to be tough to do something like that. And I don't think any of those guys want to go anywhere, to be frank, unless things really get ugly this season. You're not going to fire Mike Sullivan. As I put it on Twitter this week, unless Mike Sullivan commits a felony before 2020, he's the Penguins coach for me, if I have any control over that situation. And I'm not being facetious. I'm not being hyperbolic here. I'm saying what I really feel. The guy's won 2 Stanley Cups. He unlocked a code in a lot of ways that Dan Bilesma and Mike Johnson couldn't figure out with this squad. And he got some help from the GM with some shrewd moves, and Carl Hagelin was one of them 3 seasons ago. That trade, I think, signaled a change to a faster, quicker, more high-octane Penguins team. And I'm not saying Mike Sullivan is blameless here. We could get on it for his deployment of Daniel Sprong. We could say that in some ways he pushed Marc-Andre Fleury out of town when perhaps he shouldn't, and perhaps Fleury would have been the better bet to ride out this current championship window with this group of star players. And I have said that, and I have thought that. Or we could say that maybe his approach to just get pucks in behind defensemen and go in there and work on the forecheck and create havoc, maybe teams are too quick for that now. Maybe there's a better counter for that now. And I saw that last year in covering the team up close. I thought, well, maybe this isn't the way to go, to just try to outspeed everybody and to create this controlled chaos, if you will. Perhaps the league, because it's gotten quicker, because defensemen are getting more skilled, perhaps that's not the best approach, and perhaps that's not going to work anymore for this group of Penguins. And with an older group at the core, maybe it's time to start thinking about a more deliberate game in some ways and a more controlled game. But so there are all these variables that you throw out there. But my one thing that I keep coming back to is we're not even a quarter of the way through the season here, and suddenly you get all this thrown out there by the general manager. And did I think the players and the coaching staff and management was satisfied with how the Penguins have started the season? No. Even after the winning streak in Canada, you could say, well, there was one good run in about a week. But besides that, they've been very inconsistent. I thought that when you have a team like this with a championship core, with players who have been to the mountaintop, if you expect perfect hockey in October and November, I think that's a fool's errand. And I would not base my judgments on what they do right now. I would give them a little bit more time. Maybe if they fall out of a playoff position by, say, American Thanksgiving, which is coming up in a couple of weeks here, then you start to reconsider that. Traditionally, that's the point where you can start to make some real assessments. And traditionally, that's the point in an NHL season where the standings start to have some staying power. So maybe give it a few more weeks and add up to that sample size. But even so, I'd be willing to give this team until Christmas before I start to really think about some significant moves, whether it be trades or maybe some leadership changes. So for me, it's early. And for me, it's the price of success, right? You have this team that is probably going to have a hard time getting fully engaged for these games very early in the season. I think you've seen that very early on, and I agree with that part of what Jim Rutherford had to say on his radio show this week. But also, I would say that expectations are high here in Pittsburgh, and maybe they should be high, even with a core that's getting past the age of 30. Maybe there needs to be a little bit more help, more support from the younger players, also something that Rutherford alluded to. But also, this team should expect to be there in the postseason and to have a real shot at making another run or two or three at a sixth Stanley Cup in franchise history and a fourth Stanley Cup for this group. So when you talk about success and having high standards, this is the ugly side of it. This is the negative side of it, right? It's not all pretty. It's very easy to say, well, I expect this and that. I expect them to win. And that's great to set that bar high, but perhaps when you have a team like this, getting a little bit older, maybe a little bit jaded about regular season games, it's time to let back on those expectations at this time of the year, especially. And then you go over to Chicago, where the big news in the NHL this week was that three-time Stanley Cup winning coach Joel Quenneville was shown the door after a short slump for the Blackhawks. The Hawks came out at 6-2-2, looking like they were going to overcome their miss of the playoffs last year, which might have been more attributable to an injury to their goaltender, Corey Crawford, than anything related to team construction or coaching or execution from the players. But it seems there that general manager Stan Bowman and John McDonough, the president of the Blackhawks, and maybe even the owner, Rocky Wirtz, were looking for an excuse to move on from Joel Quenneville, who is one of the more popular coaches in the NHL. And he's not just a player's coach, he's also a very successful coach. So it's not like it's a country club there in Chicago. As I mentioned, 3 Stanley Cup wins, really with 3 different types of teams. I know you had Jonathan Toews and Patrick Kane and Duncan Keith at the center of all 3 of those championships in 2010, in 2013, in 2015. But you also had supporting groups that had to be changed and tweaked and tinkered with because of the salary cap. And again, the price of success. Guys get paid. We saw it here in Pittsburgh. Pascal Dupuis, Chris Kunitz, probably paid more than they should have been. Guys who were on Stanley Cup teams like Craig Adams hung around for a lot longer than they should have because of that championship afterglow, if you will. Brent Seabrook paid way too much in Chicago, to use a Blackhawks reference. But there you see in Chicago maybe more of a drastic approach to it in firing a coach like Quenneville. Now, to be sure, I think Mike Sullivan should have a longer leash than someone like Quenneville because Sullivan hasn't been there as long as Joel Quenneville. And you could make the argument that his approach has reached its expiration date, whether we're talking about tactics or personality. Either way, I might disagree. I would say that overall it's more on the construction of the team and going out and signing Chris Kunitz. Speaking of Chris Kunitz, he's in Chicago now for some reason. That was your response to missing the playoffs. That was your big free agent signing and leaving some money on the table under the salary cap if you're Stan Bowman. So Stan Bowman and John McDonough and the people upstairs in Chicago were able to look down and say, okay, here's our bullet. We'll fire it. We'll fire Joel Quenneville, and we'll move on from that. It seems drastically unfair for me, but it's the price of success. And when you win, this is what happens on the backside. It's not pretty. No one ever thinks about this when you talk about championships and teams that are expected to compete. It all seems like sunshine and roses and rainbows, right? Well, no. When it ends badly. And there's a saying that nothing ends well, or otherwise it wouldn't end, right? There's always a reason to move on and to change things. So for the Penguins and the Blackhawks, 2 teams that as of 13 months ago, I was thinking, oh, we're looking at maybe an ultimate Game 7, if you will. 2 teams that have won 3 Stanley Cups apiece with their current star cores in the salary cap era. Dare we to dream of an ultimate Game 7, of a Stanley Cup final between the two to decide who gets those bragging rights? I think I talked about that on this show, in fact, a couple of times. Maybe even 2 summers ago after the Penguins won back-to-back Cups and tied the Blackhawks in Cup-era championships. I thought, man, wouldn't it be something if these 2 teams went head-to-head? Now the Blackhawks, well, they've put their team under the control of a 33-year-old. Someone my age is coaching an NHL team now. That also makes me think and makes me wonder, maybe I need to kick it up a notch or two. But seriously, it makes me wonder, are they just going through a rebuild without really calling it that in Chicago? Or is this the start of a downfall for Chicago? Do they need to step back before they can step forward? We saw in Pittsburgh, not intentionally maybe, with the hiring of Mike Johnston and with hanging on to Ray Shero and Dan Bilesma a little bit longer than maybe they should have. They had their hiccups, but they were able to recover because their stars were still in their primes. But it doesn't look like we're going to be seeing that Penguins-Blackhawks series. And if you had to bet, you would bet on neither one of these teams winning another championship with their current groups because of all the flaws and all the downfalls of success. Like I said, the cost of success is great. And you wouldn't take away these moments. That's why you savor these moments. That's why it always frustrated me, and it got me upset when I heard Penguins fans complaining in the midst of these Stanley Cup runs, even after the Stanley Cup runs. Yes, it's very much in play to analyze and to say, well, this should have been done, that should have been done. And I was at the forefront of it this past summer saying that Jack Johnson was a bad gamble from Jim Rutherford. I was not alone in that, but I'm just saying I'm not immune to that, and I think you can step back from your emotional side and say rationally this is not a good move. But I also feel like I savored every moment of those championship seasons because they don't come around that long or that come around that often, and it might be a long, long time before you get back to that mountaintop. And no one is on the mountaintop forever, especially in a salary cap league, especially in a sport like hockey that, let's be honest, has more luck involved than say, basketball, where you can just roll LeBron James out or Kevin Durant out and expect to win. It's more luck involved than, say, football as well, where you can have a really good quarterback and a Tom Brady and just build around him for 15, 20 years. It's a little bit different in hockey. You got to have things go right, and, sometimes things could be going right in the long term, but in the short term, you get frustrated and you make some drastic moves. I hope it doesn't happen here in Pittsburgh because I think this group deserves a chance to prove their GM wrong, who apparently is getting that itchy trigger finger. This is Gike's Got Game on the River's Edge. That's the end of the first period on today's show. I will be back after this sampling of local music to talk about hockey of a different form. Penn State RMU, a fascinating college hockey collision this weekend, and I'll get into exactly why after this break.
According to the Oxford Dictionary, the word jagoff is defined as a noun, which means a stupid, irritating, or...
John and Rachel from the Jagoff podcast, and we are at the River's Edge.
And starting on 7/5, we will be here every Thursday at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Right, so that means like we are at the River's Edge.
Right.
Here, we're inside your little computer, and we're talking all about the cool things going on in Pittsburgh.
All things Pittsburgh.
Yep.
Listen in Thursdays at 10.
And back at Mr. Small's Theater, this is Gike's Got Game. I am Matt Geica. Of course, if you're watching on Facebook, you already know that. Thanks to Brian Crawford for putting the lovely photo of, formerly Consol Energy Center, now PPG Paints Arena. I hate when arenas change names because it automatically dates certain photos. But, Brian, I don't know how you feel about that, but you and I both grew up in an era when it was Civic Arena. I guess it was Mellon Arena in 2000, so that was our first real experience with the corporate naming structure. Three Rivers Stadium had its name for the entirety of its lifespan, 30 years. Then you got PNC Park and Heinz Field. I will say that I like the corporate names here in Pittsburgh because each one of them makes me think of a Pittsburgh company or a Pittsburgh-based enterprise, so I suppose it could be worse.
This is true, and I look at Philadelphia where they have the Wells Fargo Center, and I have really, really deep hatred for Wells Fargo.
So that doesn't help.
Yeah. So it kind of fits, actually. I'm with you. I don't know. I'm old school. I still call it Star Lake Amphitheater. I know it's had like a million names since then.
I grew up out there, so that's what that's what we had beaten into our brains when it was first established. Sure. I think it's now Key Bank Pavilion, I want to say, but
you're right.
It was Post-Gazette Pavilion for a long time. That's one that I say. When I worked there, that's what it was called. So
I like that because it's a local company. It's kind of like you were saying the sponsors that we have for these other arenas. PPG Paints, that's local. Heinz Field, Heinz is local. PNC. I like that. I think that's nice.
Yeah, at least we have that, right? So, like you said, Wells Fargo. I'm not sure I think about Philadelphia when I think about that. So, it could be worse. I'll put it that way. and I'm not one to look back to the past automatically as some great thing, so I don't want to come off like that as the old-timer complaining. But in this case, I do miss when you could, post a photo or talk about an old building. For instance, I was thinking back to Robert Morris Hockey, which I'm going to talk about right here, when we played our first Three Rivers Classic game. It was called Consol Energy Center. So I had to go back and change a couple of things that I was writing, because it's like, oh yeah, that's right, it wasn't PPG Paints, it was Consol for a while. And
that's going to be confusing too, especially on the historical aspect. I never really thought of it in that term, because you would just...
Yeah, it's because in record keeping, you have to say what the building was called, I guess, right at the time.
Yeah.
But it's the same building, so...
That is confusing.
Right. I don't know if historians from the 19th century had that problem, I'll put it that way. Anyway, Brian, good to see all the election coverage here this past week. I just wanted to commend you and the folks at the River's Edge, your interview with Connor Lamb, who got elected to a new term there. As we were discussing last week, it felt kind of weird that he was up for re-election again 6 months after taking office, but I suppose that's what happens when the congressional districts get switched around. So was that fun for you to be part of the political process there? I know that you enjoy being part of the Millvale community, so I'm sure that was one part of it that really appealed to you.
Yeah, it's interesting. That was the second year not the second year in a row. We took last year off due to my work schedule, but that's the second time that we've done an election night coverage live with results and stuff. So that was fun. We had Jeff Benton on the show for the live coverage that Tuesday, and he is going to be running for city council against Darlene Harris, so we were able to get the perspective of someone who's going to be running for local city council and what he thought these races meant for him, or what his thoughts were on the pulse of the community in these elections. So it was neat. And yeah, then that election with Connor Lamb is really interesting, because neither one of both are representatives who are incumbents in districts that are not the 17th.
Yes.
And it's the 17th now, so it's really confusing. And the district that Connor Lamb was in before, I could have voted in my hometown, but I couldn't have voted in Millvale. The district he's in now, I can vote for in Millvale, but I couldn't have voted for back in my hometown.
Yeah, that's always a dilemma when these things are changed, right? I suppose they did what they could, and well, he's back in office. I'm sure credited to your interview, I would say.
Oh, of course.
Yeah, that would be the thing that put him over the top. Yeah,
even though he was like way ahead.
I didn't want to mention the margin because it was rather large.
Yeah.
So hey, every little bit, I suppose. And if you're a congressional candidate, if you are a congressman or woman, I don't see why you wouldn't do all the local publicity that is possible. So,
well, especially for a Congress race, because Congress is truly a local election. Even though it's even though you're doing your job in Washington, your voters are local, and it's not like a Senate race where you're going across state. You are looking at a specifically targeted area in the Commonwealth. So it is a local election in that regard.
Well, there you have it. Election coverage was knocked out of the park by the River's Edge this past week. Thanks, Brian, for joining me briefly here. I'll take the rest of this segment actually to answer some Facebook comments. I have a few, so thank you for that. Greg Fish, who's a frequent watcher and contributor, in fact, to this show, says a couple of things. First of all, he says, in the NHL, usually the coach goes first. Sully has already lasted longer than most. Well, yeah, he should have lasted longer than most. He's won, in his 3 full seasons. He's won 2 Stanley Cups. So I think that buys you some time, right, Greg? I think you would agree with that. He's not just some schmo who has muddled his way to a couple of middle-of-the-pack finishes in his 3 years in control. Actually, it's 2 full seasons for Sullivan. That's it, because he came in 15-16 midway through. So 16-17, 17-18, he's had 2 full seasons. And I know the Penguins are notorious for tearing through coaches. Remember when Dan Bilesman made it through, 3 or 4 straight years? That made him the longest tenured coach in franchise history. Excuse me. So it's not just hockey. It's the Penguins in particular. We're used to, just this turnover. And I would rebel against that disposable mentality when it comes to coaching. These are people. These are humans that you invest in. I think that's how I would approach it. I would not be quick to change a coach if I were a GM. That would be the last thing I think about. I think about changing players first, because you invest in a coach. A coach establishes a culture. A coach establishes a program. Maybe it's because I'm hanging out more with coaches now at the RMU Athletic Department, but I feel like I associate more with coaches than I used to. growing up as a Penguins fan, you think, we'll just get rid of this guy, we'll move on to something else. The team will respond to someone differently. And if you are a Penguins fan, to be clear, you would be somewhat justified in having that view because they've won 3 of their 5 Stanley Cups under new coaches. Now, one time was Scotty Bowman stepping in, and you're not always going to have a Scotty Bowman at your disposal, and you're not always going to have a coach in Badger Bob who was physically no longer able to continue coaching. And, of course, he passed away from brain cancer early in that back-to-back Stanley Cup season of 91-92. So that's a little bit different there, but you had 2 mid-season coaching replacements that led to Stanley Cups. That happens, once a decade typically, maybe even more sparse than that in NHL history. You can count them on one hand, I suppose, but you have Dan Bylsma and Mike Sullivan doing it. So the Penguins have pulled it off before, but this sort of thing doesn't happen very often. You're catching lightning in a bottle, and you also, in both of those cases, had 2 of the best hockey players on the planet, maybe the 2 best hockey players on the planet on your team, and so you're more likely to have a surge at any time, let alone with a new coach. Maybe it didn't have so much to do with that as it just did with law of averages and a bigger sample size leading to the success that you would have had no matter who was in charge of the team. To be clear, I'm not saying that about either Bylsma or Mike Sullivan. But just think about that and think about how rare it is for a coach to step in and then win a championship later that year. And Greg did go on to say, I want to be fair to Greg here on Facebook. He says, not saying JR fires him, but there's definitely a short shelf life of coaches in the NHL. Yes, I agree, but I don't agree with the premise behind it. I just wouldn't be like that as a GM. Aaron Grice, by the way, a winner of one of our free T-shirts last week, our T-shirt giveaway for Mr. Small's Cafe. Aaron says, who do you think Jim Rutherford should target in a trade? I don't even want to talk about it, Aaron. I don't think anybody should be on the block right now. I think this team, as I said in the opening segment, deserves some time to get to the point where changes are considered at mid-season. End of December is where I would go. Maybe that's a little bit too long for some of you out there, but not for me. I think this group deserves a chance. Even though I felt like the Jack Johnson signing was bad, I think he deserves a chance to settle in. I think everyone on this team deserves a chance to show what they are and not be booted out. So there you have it anyway. We'll take a break here, and I'll bring it back for college hockey after this. I wanted to get to your comments, and it's great to have some comments, right? Fired up about having the interaction here on both riversedgepgh.com/live and Facebook Live. This is Gike's Got Game, a hockey-heavy edition of Gike's Got Game on the River's Edge.
Are you hungry for science? I'm Carissa Sedor.
And I'm Ralph Crew.
And we host the Carnegie Science Center's podcast, Science News and Cues.
Also known as Snack.
Join us twice a month as we talk about exciting science news, answer science questions submitted by listeners, that's you, and dive deep into a cool topic every episode.
Curious about exoplanets, glowing animals, or even your own poop? Well, do we have the show for you?
We also feature special guests from octopuses to famous YouTube science stars to NASA scientists.
Join us on Snack, and remember,
stay
hungry for science.
Back on Gike's Got Game, I am the eponymous host of the show, if you want to put it that way, Matt Gajtka, MattGajtka on Twitter. If you're watching, you probably already accessed me via the social media channels. If you are listening on the River's Edge, then welcome to the show. We have archived versions right there on the website, in addition to the live broadcast on the live stream. Funny how that works out. Every Friday from 10 to 11 a.m. And plenty of hockey talk so far on the program. I want to shift from pro to college, and I know there's still many of you in the Pittsburgh hockey market who aren't really well acquainted with college hockey yet. And I understand we're still in our first generation, really, of D1 college hockey in Pittsburgh, when both the Robert Morris men and women came into existence about 15 years ago. I suppose 14 years ago for the women, 15 years ago for the men. That was a fresh new thing, and also Robert Morris doesn't have the student base. It doesn't have the alumni base of a Pitt or a Penn State. So I think it was a slow burn for a lot of people to realize that, oh yeah, this is pretty good hockey. This is enjoyable. This is a different version of the sport that I love so much at the pro level. And different doesn't have to mean better or worse, but I think different in a lot of ways is good. It can give you a different perspective, for that matter, on the sport and just how darn good the pros are, I think, as well. So many Penguins fans are spoiled, I'll put it that way, and you probably realize that if you are a Penguins fan. We've had the best players of the last 2 generations work here in Pittsburgh, from an offensive standpoint at least, in Mario Lemieux and Sidney Crosby. I suppose there could be a debate on Lemieux versus Gretzky, but in terms of pure talent, I don't think there is. And you also have Jaromir Jagr, one of the all-time greatest in the history of the sport. So you hear people complain about, this guy can't play, that guy can't play. Well, they're in the NHL. They're pretty darn good. So when I have gone about my career, I've worked in junior hockey. I've called high school hockey games locally here for Peters Township. I've worked in college hockey. You realize how good those players are even, and you realize how good the NHL players are too. So I think it's very healthy to experience the game at different levels, not just see it at the top of the top. But that's not why I find college hockey fascinating. It's, of course, all the pageantry and emotion that gets people fired up, a lot of people fired up about college football. I'm not a big college football guy. For me, I didn't grow up watching college football because my family didn't really have a college team. We didn't go to college as a family until I went to Marshall 15 years ago. So maybe you can relate to my experience there. Also, Pittsburgh is such a pro town. I think it's tough finding some oxygen if you are a non-pro team that doesn't play football especially. But I think in the past few years, with Robert Morris's level of success on both the men's and the women's side of things, that they're generating interest organically. It's not just being incidental contact with the pro teams at, say, the Three Rivers Classic coming up again this holiday season. People are following them for their own merits, and that's encouraging. That's what I'm trying to promote as I work at RMU. So college hockey is something that I'll continue to proselytize for. I'm not going to make any bones about that here on this show. But if you are just a sports fan, I think this weekend's matchup between the RMU men and the Penn State men on the college hockey side of things is particularly interesting. And I got into why a little bit at the top of the show. 2 of the newer teams, in fact, until 2 years ago, they were the 2 newest teams in D1 college hockey. And college hockey is a very traditional sport in a lot of ways. You have your schools out east. You have Hockey East with all those teams, the Boston colleges, the Boston universities, the Ivy League schools play college hockey, and they always have. Your Colgates, your Eastern Seaboard stuff, very old universities with a lot of tradition, teams that have been playing for a long time. Your Maines and New Hampshires and Vermonts, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have the teams out west, the Midwest teams, all the teams in Michigan. I don't know how many D1 teams are in Michigan. It's like 6 or 7, I think, on the men's side. Strangely, not on the women's side, but they're working on that, it looks like. But you have Michigan, Michigan State, and Northern Michigan, Michigan Tech, Western Michigan, Ferris State, so many. Lake Superior State, also in the state of Michigan. So you have these places that have carved out their fan bases and their little spot in the college hockey world. And you have Minnesota, you have Wisconsin. So these places have had college hockey for so long. And then there's Robert Morris, and then there's Penn State. And both have been successes in their own ways. Both teams have been to the NCAA tournament. Robert Morris had to be more of a slow burn because of limitations on the resources side of things. They did not have a $100 million donation from Terry Pagula to start their program. They built it from scratch, basically. And I really appreciate what Derek Schooley has done as the only head coach. I mean, you're the head coach, you're basically the GM of a team at the college level. That's how it goes in any sport, but particularly in the bigger revenue sports like your college hockey, your basketball, and your football in particular. So that's been a labor of love, and that's been a hard push for 15 years. RMU men's hockey now in its 15th season. The Colonials have won a couple of league championships. They've won 3 of them, in fact, 1 in the postseason, 2 in the regular season. They've made the NCAA tournament. And now you see Penn State, a totally different approach, but again, a newcomer. So there is that kinship in that way between RMU and Penn State. They're both fighting for a spot at the table in a very traditional sport in college hockey. And it's encouraging to see, if you are a hockey fan, I want to see hockey grow, and I've talked about this frequently on this show, and I've written about it too. I want to see hockey grow as a sport, not just because the Penguins are good, not just because of the top level. The NHL is compelling. That certainly helps, don't get me wrong, and I think so much of it is a trickle-down effect, and we've seen that with the increased youth participation in Western Pennsylvania over the past decade plus in the Crosby-Malkin era. There's no doubt it's because the Penguins are good, and that's what gets people attracted to the sport when you see the best of the best play. And I think the best way to create a fan base for hockey is to have an NHL team nearby, and that's why I've been okay with Gary Bettman in the NHL hanging on to hope in places like Phoenix/Arizona or Miami, because I think if you have a couple of good seasons, if you have some compelling characters there, it can do wonders for the sport. And I think the sport is great. I play it personally. I think if you play it, you're a fan for life. You're hooked for life. I think if you go to an NHL game, for the most part, you are hooked on it. It's like a drug to watch in person. And if you see it on TV, and you only see it on TV, and you experience it that way or on your device, yeah, it's good, but I don't know if you can really appreciate the physicality, the speed, the difficulty, the technical ability that it requires, the physicality. It's all there. And I don't have to really tell many of you out there, if you are in Pittsburgh and you're a sports fan, if you follow me and you like what I do, then I'm pretty sure you like hockey as well. Not that that's all I talk about, but it's a major part of what I talk about. So for me, it's very encouraging to see local college hockey programs. If you want to call Penn State local or not, it's up in the air, right? But there are no greater numbers of Penn State alums by county in the country than here in Allegheny County. So yeah, there are plenty of blue and white fans, as you well know. Maybe you're one of them. Maybe you've been a follower of what Guy Gadowski has done up there in what they're now calling Hockey Valley. So I've been up there for one game as a spectator to see Penn State play Michigan. I'm excited to be able to go up there as a member of the RMU traveling party tonight and hoping to spoil the party at Pagula Ice Arena. And I'm fired up to provide the play-by-play on Facebook Live on our RMU men's hockey page, and also do my usual post-game reports, the rink report from up north and east, I suppose. And just to have this series back, there were a couple of seasons when RMU didn't play Penn State, and I thought they should have found a way to get it going again as soon as possible. And that's on Penn State, really, for pulling out of the Three Rivers Classic. That's where the two teams met every year for 4 straight seasons. Penn State pulled out, but now we have this home-and-home situation, and I hope they can continue because these two teams should play. I know, apologies to Mercyhurst, also a Western Pennsylvania D1 program, but RMU and the city of Pittsburgh and Penn State with its big alumni base and its big pull in terms of just the casual sports fan nationwide and also in the area, it just has to happen. And it's good for the game for these two teams to play. And I wrote earlier this week that the one word that comes to mind when I think RMU playing Penn State, for all the reasons that I just mentioned, besides the fact they've had some good success on the ice, but the off-the-ice stuff too, but the one word I think about is fun. And that's what sports is all about, right? It's fun. It should happen. And we see it so often in college sports. Just look at Pitt and Penn State on the football side. They won't be playing again for many years. Look at Pitt and West Virginia, football and basketball, but especially football. They did not play for the longest time, it seems like. The backyard brawl was going on forever for 100-plus years, and then it takes this break because of the pull for greater revenue in college sports and conferences splitting up. And it happens in college hockey, too. Penn State arriving ushered in the era of the Big Ten, and it really upset a lot of people in the traditional enclaves of college hockey. So this sport is not immune to that sort of thing, but I'm glad that Derek Schooley and Guy Gadowski have found that in their schedules, especially on the RMU side, you don't get many non-conference games. So to carve out this time and this opportunity to play each other tonight at Pagula, tomorrow at the Island, would love to see you down there. Intimate atmosphere, you're right on top of the action, but tickets are going pretty quick, so I wouldn't wait until tomorrow. In fact, I just tweeted out the ticket link at RMUM Hockey on Twitter, so you can find it there. You can go to the website, rmucolonials.com. Experience college hockey. If you do, I think you'll get a greater appreciation for the sport in general and also for these talented student athletes. Back in a moment to wrap up Guy's Got Game. I'm going to kill a cliche. I haven't done that in a while, but overtime's a perfect time to get right back into that routine. We're here on the River's Edge from Mr. Small's Theater in Millville.
Hey folks, it's Mike Sasson of The Mike Sasson Show. Me and Alex, my producer extraordinaire, looked at the landscape of internet radio and figured if we want to make it, we've got to work. at least an hour earlier. Now on at 9 a.m. every Tuesday on the River's Edge, a new kind of radio.
Let's kill a cliche on Gike's Got Game in just a moment here. It's overtime on my weekly show here from Mr. Small's Theater. More interaction on Facebook. Andrew Wisniewski, a friend of mine from RMU, who's actually going to the game tonight at Pagula. He says it should be a great series. Couldn't agree more why it's a good thing for the local hockey scene. Excited to be in the crowd tonight up at Hockey Valley. I'll be looking for that RMU jersey down there in the stands. Andrew, as I crack the mic for the 7 o'clock face-off. Nothing as pure as play-by-play, as far as I'm concerned in sports media. Everyone wants to do play-by-play. Maybe they don't. I always felt like most people did, and I'm just happy to get the opportunity to do so. I don't take that for granted at all. Well, to start the show, folks, I could have used a cliche because I broke down a lengthy quote from Jim Rutherford on the Penguins radio network earlier this week. I could have said, there's a lot to unpack here, but I didn't say that because I really despise that phrase. And that is the cliche, or the cliched phrase that I'm intending to take a look at and hopefully purge that, expunge that from your vocabulary if you do use it. I'm not saying that it has never been appropriate to use, but I find it to be faux intellectual. Where was the first time I saw that phrase? There's a lot to unpack here. And what you're saying is there's a lot in this subtext. As far as that's concerned, there's a lot of deeper meaning to this beyond the surface, or we need to analyze this. There are all different ways to say something like that, but that phrase, there's a lot to unpack here, exactly said that way. Maybe that's what bothers me. If you just said, I want to unpack this, I suppose that's all right, but there's a lot to unpack here. It just sounds like you're Mr. Snob, Mr. Ivory Tower analyst, gonna tell me exactly what I'm missing from this statement. I realize it's a complicated thing. I realize that there's more to it than meets the eye, or that we need to dig into it. But when things get repetitive, maybe that's my biggest complaint. When this gets repetitive, when it's said over and over again, when everyone decides, oh, this is what I'm going to say, this is the phrase du jour, that's when I get ticked off. So that is really my main complaint with there's a lot to unpack here. Actually, it conjures up a mental picture, which usually, for me, excuses the use of a cliche, right? But sometimes something is used so much by so many people in so many walks of life. My pastor uses it at our local church, and every time he says it, I just, that bothers me. Say something different once in a while. Mix it up. The human mind desires variety, and variety is the spice of life. There's a cliche, but there's one that's very true, and that's one that I will end Gike's Got Game on for another week. Thanks to Brian Crawford for engineering the show and for his input in the second period of today's program. Thank you to you. You're the most important part of this show. Otherwise, I'd just be screaming into the void. Again, I am Matt Geiker reminding you that when the radio fades, you know life's moving fast. Looking forward to a big college hockey weekend in Western PA. But whether or not your weekend involves that, I wish you a blessed one, and I'll see you on the other side next Friday right here from Millvale.